Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday. Today is day 5 of our 10-day accessibility challenge, and it has been a just fantastic week. To those of you who are participating, thanks for sticking with it, and we're happy to see you here this afternoon. And for those of you who are not participating, we are happy that you have chosen to join us today as well to learn a little bit about one of the 5 principles of accessibility here on Oswego's campus. My name is Michelle Thornton. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Business, and I am our accessibility fellow coordinator for this year. And I am presenting today with my colleague, Rebecca Mushter, who you can introduce yourself, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. I'm sure most of you probably know me. I'm the Associate Director of CELT and also a faculty member in graphic design and interaction design.
Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead. While we're going to be kind of tag teaming back and forth on our presentation, I will be sharing my screen. I'm going to pull up my slides and talk a little bit about what the game plan is for our presentation today. All right, let me go into presenter mode here. All right, so Rebecca, can I get a thumbs up? Can you see everything okay?
Looks good.
Great. All right, so we are going to be focusing, like I said, on one of the 5 key principles of accessibility here on campus. Today I'm talking about color and contrast, which means that unlike a lot of the slides you've been seeing this week, we get cool graphics like this. I was very excited, Rebecca. This is unlike your typical approach. Normally you're pretty straightforward, so that's exciting. The nice rainbow at the bottom of it, very on topic. But that's kind of the point. We're going to talk about when that makes sense to use, when it doesn't, and why you might not always want to when you think that you should be using color. So color is one of 5 principles we've been talking about this week. We started off on Wednesday talking about content types and how to kind of make Word and Google Docs more accessible. Yesterday, we talked about hyperlinks. Next week, we're jumping into text equivalence, and clear language has been something we've been discussing throughout the challenge, but we're focusing in on that number 3 one today. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off and let Rebecca get us started of setting some foundation about the use of color.
So given my design background, this seems like a topic that I could tackle, right? So what I was hoping we could start with is a quick conversation. So I hope people will jump in about why we use color in presentations or other materials that we're creating and sharing with others. Anyone want to jump in either in chat or unmuting their microphone for a minute to just talk a little bit about why we use color?
To make it more interesting looking.
Yeah, okay, good. Lots of stuff coming in the chat now. Engagement, make it appealing, draw attention, right? And sometimes it can help emphasize something, right? Or make something more clear for individuals. Branding, good. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why we use color. So the point of this presentation is not to say like we should still use color, right? But we want to make sure we're using color wisely. So one of the things that I wanted to just indicate before we get too far is that color has multiple properties. And when we think of color, we tend to think of hue. So we think of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, but there's also intensity involved in that color and value. So like how light and dark it is, how bright it is, right? Those are also color properties that we don't always think about when we're thinking about color. But these are properties that we really need to think about in terms of color when we're using it in presentations or other materials we're creating in terms of accessibility. All of those things combined together, wait 1 second, Michelle. All those things together kind of formulate this idea of contrast. And that's really a difference between kind of the lightness and the brightness of something versus how dark or kind of toned down it might be. So in this example, all of the color contrast here, like the black on orange, the green on black, and the dark purple on a very weird color of pink, have an 8.4 to 1 relative luminance contrast ratio. So they all have the same amount of contrast, even though they're all different color schemes. And that's at a level of contrast that would be appropriate to read something on the screen. Okay, Michelle. So the first thing I want to just point out is that our first tip is that we don't want to use color alone to convey meaning. There's a lot of ways to convey meaning. We can use words to convey meaning. We can use shape to convey meaning. We can use color, texture, a wide variety of things. But we want to make sure that we're not relying on just one thing to convey that meaning, especially if it's color. So here are some examples. You'll notice on the far left, there's a stop sign. In a stop sign, there are 3 ways that stop is being conveyed to you, right? Color, so red means stop, right? The word stop, and also this shape of the sign, right? Which is an octagon. So that's a pretty standardized international way of saying stop. Although the language might be different in different countries, for example, that shape and color combination means stop. We also have traffic lights, right, which also rely on color to convey information. And one thing you might not think about is that in addition to color, there's also location. So red, stop, is always on top, right? And green, go, is on the bottom. It's really important that there's this location feature as well, because red and green are actually one of the most common areas that people have color blindness, right? Where they can't distinguish between red and green because they're the same kind of intensity and the same kind of value. So they can render very similarly for folks. So that additional position feature is really important because it helps to convey that information in a different way. And then finally, very similar to the stop sign is the yield sign. The international symbol of kind of a red outline with a white center in a triangle form means yield. And so that is a way that we convey slowing down, being cautious, right, and being careful. Now, of course, there are other places in other cultures of the world where the symbols are a bit different, but it is a pretty common shape, and it's certainly the one that we've adopted in the United States. The next thing that we need to think about is when we are using color, we need to meet contrast standards, and we cannot rely on our own ability to perceive color to determine whether or not our contrast has been met. Okay, so we need tools to help us with this. So one example I really like to show is this example of a football game where the jerseys are all solid colors. One is green and one is red. On the left-hand side, you'll see green. On the right-hand side, you'll see red. However, if you have certain kinds of color blindness or you don't perceive color as well, you might see what's on the next slide, which makes it really difficult to distinguish between the two teams. Certainly, you can see like the symbols on the helmets or whatever, but not when they're moving quickly, right, across the screen. So relying on solid color uniforms doesn't work well. So you'll notice that most teams use different strategies these days. And our third tip for today is to use a limited color palette. Now, sometimes folks think like, let's use color to make it interesting. Well, we want to make it interesting, but we also want it to make sure that people can focus on what they need to focus on. We don't need fireworks every 5 seconds when we're trying to concentrate or learn something new. So what I highly recommend is limiting how much variation there is and make sure that you're kind of theming things within a limited color palette. So the next slide demonstrates this. You have any idea what to look at on this slide? I don't. My eyes like, wait, there's a thing that's all colors. Wait, there's something else that's highlighted in yellow. Wait, there's other things that are in blue. What am I supposed to look at? Right? So if you have too much going on, too much variation in color and other kind of stylistic choices being made, it's distracting. Folks aren't sure what to look at or pay attention to. They're not really sure what it means because now now color has meaning, but now we can't quite figure out what that meaning is. And you spend all this time trying to figure out what the color's trying to convey. And it can put focus on the visual choices and things rather than the actual content or what it is that you want people to actually pay attention to. So we don't want to do this. And unfortunately, we see a lot of this. So here's an example of how maybe you could arrange a slide that does use color, where you might limit to 2 to 3 colors, a light, a dark, and maybe a medium. In this particular color palette, you'll see there's kind of it's an off-white kind of a cream color in the background that I've used as my light. The dark color is actually a dark brown. It might read to you as black and white, but it's a little more subtle than that, right? It's slightly fancier than just black and white. And actually reducing that contrast just a smidge helps it not dance on the screen for people. And then that medium blue that's across the top is accessible as long as it's using large type on top of it. So the dark or the light could go on top of it as long as it is very large in size. When you limit your color palette and make things consistent, you can focus on the content. If you use the same kind of coloring or design technique for the same kind of content specifically, it can be a shortcut for people to know what kind of content you're pointing them to. It minimizes distractions, and it can also just help set the tone or mood. So the next thing I want to share with you are just a couple of tools that you can use to kind of get you going. So the one that I want to point everyone to, and I'm going to give you a link right in the chat box. So everyone, make sure you quickly click on it and get ready to download. So this is a really great piece of software. It's free. And actually, you know, can you skip to the next slide? I put them in the wrong order, Michelle. That's totally my bad. So when you go to this website, you see this page. And the first time I went here and the first time I sent students here to get this tool, it was like, what do you click on? Because there's a bunch of links and stuff, and I wasn't sure. So I'm pointing it out to you here. There's a big blue box on the right-hand column. It doesn't really look like a button, but indeed, that's the one you click on when you go to this web page. And once you get there, then can you go one slide back, Michelle? Thank you, sorry. Then you end up on this really scary looking page. And it is scary because it's basically the code for the website, and it's code for the tool, and it's on GitHub. And so it is a little just overwhelming and scary looking, but it's actually not that scary. If you're a Mac user, you're going to click on the file called CCA-3.1.2.dmg. That's the one that a Mac user would download and install on their computer. And if you're a Windows user, you're looking for the CCA-3.1.2.exe file. And I'm going to also just copy and paste that and put that also in the chat. So if you're confused, you can copy that note for yourself for later. And basically what this tool allows you to do is no matter what software you're in, you can use an eyedropper and pick up the color and find out what the color contrast is between the foreground and the background. So the text on top of the background color, and make sure that it meets standards. So I have an example for you, which is 2 slides away, Michelle. There we go. So imagine you're designing an ad. You might not be a designer, so maybe you're not designing an ad, but here's my example. And on the surface, you might think that the text at the bottom, which is, you know, like a dark mauve on top of a very light purple, might have enough contrast. It seems like there's a dark on a light. It might seem okay. And before we move forward, Mary's asking about CTS to host it. And no, the answer is no. I asked. What they want to do is direct you to this site so that you always have the most up-to-date version, because this is a place where it will always have the most up-to-date version. And you should be able to download on your own computer. It's free as long as you have admin privileges. And if you have any issues downloading it, CTS said to contact the help desk and they'll help you out. All right, so on the next slide, you can see that we're paying attention to that area down at the bottom. And there are color codes for the colors here. I pre-looked at these. So those are the color codes for the text versus the background. And on the next slide, it's what the tool looks like when you're using it. So I used the little eyedropper, which is up in the top right-hand corner, and got that color. And it's just like a color picker. And then I grabbed the background, and you can see a little sample preview about 1/3 of the way down, 2/3 of the way down, where it's that like mauve color on that light purple. And if you see at the very bottom, it says WCAG or WCAG 2.1 results. That's actually measuring against the accessibility standard we recommend folks use, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. and it's at the AA level is what we really want to be concerned about. And so if you look down there, you'll see that it fails at regular text and it passes at large text. So the first question you should ask is, what's the difference between large text and normal text, right? We're not really hitting large text until you're at about 18 point, right? So it needs to be pretty big for it to be considered large text. And then each of those sizes, normal text, and normal text really should be 12 point or 16 pixels if you're on screen and not any smaller than that. And when we're talking about text, if you have text on a slide, it should be 24 point or bigger. So AA standards for contrast is like a 4.5 to 1 ratio, and that's what would make it pass. And for large text, it's 3 to 1. And so in this case, it's 3.3 to 1. So it just barely passes that large text requirement. So using a tool like this can help you make sure you know whether or not the colors you're using really meet the standards necessary for what you're trying to accomplish. And now I'm going to pass it over to Michelle, who's going to do some demos in our Microsoft applications for how to deal with color.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm going to actually stop my share and then I'm going to reshare again. But one thing that I will say in my time working with Rebecca as a fellow, and then subsequently on some research projects that we've done together, the biggest takeaway that I've learned is that making assumptions about the default, whether it's colors or fonts or sizes that are given to you in Microsoft tools, are generally speaking not actually accessible. So it was something that I had to kind of retrain my brain to be thinking about, is that when I would create, for example, graphs, charts, things like that to visualize my data that I was using in either classes that I was sharing or in presentations or just even for manuscripts that I was working on, sort of that kind of assumption that that what Microsoft was spitting out would actually work or meet any of these standards was the wrong one. So this is something that we see a lot where, we go to different meetings or presentations on campus where folks are trying to share with us survey results, performance information, anything like that. And we recognize that a lot of those slides, that information that's being shared, is actually not accessible. So what I wanted to do is kind of walk you through how I figured out, or not how I figured out, but the process essentially of kind of creating that more accessible content in an actual tool. So if you bear with me here 1 second, I'm going to reshare my screen and we're going to start in Microsoft Excel. Okay, so in a very sort of timely example of this, many of you know that anybody who is participating in the challenge, we've been asking you some questions along the way. And one thing that we were looking at and wanted to convey in our kickoff was who was participating in the challenge. So this is fairly basic survey data where we would see we've got a breakdown of students and faculty. And what I wanted to do was show that in a pie chart, right? So circle with different categories represented by the percentage that they make up of the whole population. So if you are somebody who works in Excel or not, this is a fairly easy task. You would highlight this and I would insert a chart, and I knew I wanted a pie chart. So I'd come down here and I would just grab a pie chart. And it's going to pull that up for me right away. So the first thing that we know I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so you guys can see it, but relative to the conversation that we're having today, looking at these blue, orange, yellow, and gray, these all kind of fall into that medium category that Rebecca was just talking about. There's nothing that's super dark here. There's definitely nothing that would call as really light. And so it starts to get all messy and muddled together. If you're somebody that has challenges seeing, differentiating between these types of things, the contrast just isn't there with this. There's some other problems that come up right away. So we can certainly quickly fix things like, the size of the key. for example. But really, I think what you're going to find, and I've got actually some of these set up already here, that even with making the font larger, while that's helpful, it still uses that colors that are hard to distinguish between. So when I look at staff and students at the bottom, if I can't distinguish between them in the top, I still can't distinguish between them in the key either. So we really want to think about actually choosing an example or a style of the chart that provides labels in another way. So if we think back to what we talked about with the stop sign, I think this is a really great example here. The stop sign signaled to us to stop in 3 different ways: the name, the color, and the shape. And so we can provide those signals on things like a pie chart in the same way. So the first thing I would do is here, we have both the key on the right-hand side, but then we also, right into the pie chart itself, put those labels in there. So if you are somebody that wants to know how this works, I'm going to go back to our original one here. And essentially, in this case, in Excel, you would go up to chart design, and this is one of the options available. If you drop down the menu, you could see it right here, and that would change it. But again, super small does not mean any sort of 24-point font guidelines. So I would just double click on those and head back and increase that size of those. Great. Okay. So that is the first thing, but that's still, I think we can still do better, is my point here. So the labels help definitely, and definitely distinguishes between the different section of what each section means. But the reality is that we want to get at this issue of light, dark, and how we can essentially make that more visible and distinguishable as well. So the first thing that I did was change the colors. So I moved to have one of the pie sections have no color at all in it. And then we kept the blue as sort of our darker. You could even go a little bit darker with the hue on that. And then I also used a pattern in one of the pie pieces. In this case, so I can show you guys how I did that, I like to kind of show you where we end up, and then I'll go back. All you need to do in the right-hand sort of toolbar that comes up here, it gives us the opportunity to format any of the shapes that we're working with. So the key is you have to pick a specific pie piece of the pie. And then we're going to change that color up here in the paint bucket. And we're going to put no fill in that one. Okay, that's the first thing. If I want to change my orange to that pattern, I'm going to select that. And we're going to go to a pattern fill on this one. It comes up automatically as polka dots, which are a little hard to see the polka dots there. I think that I picked this large one. One thing you want to be careful with, and we talked about this, is not making your patterns too busy. So if your spaces are really small, that's not going to be helpful because it's going to wind up just coming across as another color as well. This is one of the better ones. You could play with a couple of the different options, but the main point is if you're going to use a pattern, keep it as simple as possible. The other thing that I think would be helpful here is that this pie chart is sitting on kind of this gray background. And so generally speaking, I would likely remove that as well so that I'm not kind of blurring the edges there. And then the last thing that I did when I presented this chart at our kickoff was that I created some defined lines between the sections. And that was just further as a way to signal out with a really clear contrast with the black between the white, and the different color borders, what the different sections were. So to do that from here, you would just go into this same place that we were in under border. We go back from the automatic, which is no lines, to a solid line. And then you can change the width of that. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm in my wrong thing. Here we go. Sorry, folks.
You can toggle the fill close so you can see it better.
Thank you. There we go. And putting the width back. at any rate, you guys get the idea in this version here. So generally speaking, though, in a presentation, you're not going to present right from Excel. That typically is not what happens. You are going to want to migrate this image that you've created here into a PowerPoint or Google slide deck. So I'm going to switch over to one other tool, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about color in PowerPoint. And let you see some of the similar places where we would use that feature there. Okay, so I'm not going to presenter mode here in this PowerPoint because I'm going to try and show you the features. So we're going to leave it how it is. And in our second slide, you can see that similar pie chart that we brought up earlier. In this case, this is really important. There's two ways, or really three ways, to move between PowerPoint and Excel. What you need to be cautious about is that if you copy in Excel and you move it over just as an image where it's a static item, which is what this one is, you can see it moving around. It is all one thing. In that circumstance, you cannot change your color in PowerPoint. You have to make all of those adjustments in your Excel document first, and then move it forward to PowerPoint. So that means you have to ensure that your contrast is okay. You need to use those checkers that Rebecca was talking about in the Excel document. And most importantly, if it is a picture in your PowerPoint presentation, you have to provide alt text for it then, because this is something, all of these labels on here are not going to be able to be read by any type of screen reader at that point. So there's a number of things you need to do if you bring it over that way. Now you can also bring it over as an Excel object. So in that case, I would copy it in my Excel document. If I added in a new slide here, and I would go up to paste, you see up in the left-hand corner, and you go to paste special. And then that gives you the opportunity to bring it in as an Excel object. And then you have the ability to make changes within the PowerPoint document itself. The last thing that I want to say, and this is, I think in some cases, if you're really familiar and you like using PowerPoint and you're kind of playing around with data a lot, there is the way to start this process within PowerPoint itself. So that's what I've done here. You run into the same problems in that they come up with the sort of default colors that aren't super ideal. But let's say I wanted to, I'm going to kind of create a new slide. And if I want to, in this case, insert again a chart or a, we're going to do a bar chart here. What this does is that it opens up automatically. And of course, now because I don't think you're going to be able to see that screen. It opens up an Excel document where then I could plug in my data. And on the PowerPoint, the slides, if I, obviously manipulated and put in data values, they would adjust correctly here. But you're able to start changing the colors right within PowerPoint from this slide then. So in the same way that we did in Excel, when you click on the item that you are trying to change the color on, you can go over in the right menu and go to fill. And we can, in this case, we might want to switch to, let's make this one black. We'll keep our orange as our middle color. And then one thing you may want to even consider, either no fill, but with a border for your final lines. That still might get a little bit confusing. So we may go to then again, some type of a pattern. Okay. So the idea would be, again, keeping it simple, trying to create this contrast, but the main takeaway is that the colors, while they might look like a lovely theme provided for you by PowerPoint or Excel, generally speaking, they're all automatically falling into that same medium hue. That's sort of where they go as their default. And that is not, when we're having a conversation about accessibility, getting you where you need to be. So you do have to do some of this kind of after the fact manipulation to meet those expectations of the standard. So
And you can
I'm
add
going,
labels in here too, right, Michelle?
oh, and I'm sorry, in PowerPoint, yes. So the same way, let me come back in. Sorry about that. Okay, so in the same way up at the top where we were in Excel when we changed the format to include labels, the problem though, Rebecca, it's not going to do it in this example because there's not data associated with this. This was just a sample that
Right.
doesn't, I don't think that they'll give me the option to put data labels on it.
But that's one thing people should.
Oh, here, actually, there is an example of it. Yeah. So in this case, you can choose a different format of the chart, put that data label in again, and then we're going to increase the size of it. You get the idea that that's another way to, and this would be especially helpful if this was kind of that darker color. So if we make this, for example, the darker blue, then that color contrast comes through at that point. Rebecca, any other thoughts about?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And then if you're using a wide variety of colors, you could also put the labels on top so they could all be black or something too, is another strategy.
Yeah, in that case, you do have a workaround then, like where you would have to insert those as text boxes in PowerPoint. They do not give an option to put the labels right above it. But that certainly is another approach.
And then Debbie was asking a question, should we include alt text for all charts and graphs? And the answer, Debbie, is if it's in as an image, absolutely. If it's in as data and you're putting it in the way that we're showing you, then those things are readable by a screen reader and would provide some accessibility features for folks. But in addition, if you have like charts and graphs in a larger document, like a manuscript or something, another way of providing alt text is making sure that you're describing all of the content that's in the chart. Like, what are all the main points? Why are you including that chart in the first place and providing those data points? That kind of alt text, which may not be directly next to the image, it might be within the narrative, is also a way of providing that same content.
We have another question in the chat box, and that the question is, do you have to make all the changes each time, or is there a template that you can load that already has these settings? I have a two-part answer to that. One, you do have the ability, like let's say you want to set your color palette and you want to create that as your template for this slide, or you want to carry that forward, or for the slide deck and you want to carry that forward, you absolutely can make those changes to your new template. However, do we have one that is like sort of prescribed and ready to go by the work group or the accessibility team at Oswego? The answer to that question is no, but I love that idea. And it does seem like having some templates of accessible charts, documents, things like that built in would be a cool test that maybe we can tackle in the future.
We actually have some of those things started. However, the delivery of getting said templates to individuals is actually a multi-step process that's not super fluid that we're trying to work out. So that's actually the problem at the moment. So we're working on trying to get that so it would just be standard options that are available. There was a question earlier about the alt text. And so if you do need to put alt text, generally speaking, you can right click on an image and it will bring up an option for alt text in which you can type the text equivalent in the box. And then let's see, on a Mac, Julie, if you're using a one button mouse, then you can option click. But if you're using a 2-button mouse, you can still right click and do it. And then someone asked for the software again, so I will put that back in the chat box.
Rebecca, earlier while you were talking, I did have somebody say that they were having trouble finding, to me privately, that they were having trouble finding the CCA, the window file.
Oh, the Windows file? Let's see. So after you click on the big blue button.
I think it was the third or fourth item.
Yeah.
Third or fourth item.
It's 1, 2, I think it's the fourth. No, it's not the fourth one. Hold on. I can't see that. I have to make it bigger. Just a second. So if you're on Windows, because the file name is not the same as it was, here's the file. I'm going to put the file name for a PC in the chat. That was a typo on my part. Sorry.
Rebecca, we have another question about this software. Does it work for online programs like Canva?
So the contrast checker will work on anything you have open on your computer. Anything, which is awesome. Traditionally, the ones that we had shared previously were only available in a browser. And like you had to be able to find the like little color code and needed to know how to get the color code to work. This removes all of that out of the equation. So the hardest part of using this software is installing it on your computer. Like once it's there, it's super easy to use. There's a question about how to use the software. Let me open up something on my computer really quick and I will demo it for everybody. It's super easy. I'm on a Mac, but it will look very similar on a PC. Let's see here. All right, so you should be able to see like my entire desktop at the moment, right? Because you have to be able to see that to see it. So I'm going to launch the color contrast analyzer. And it brings up this little window. Okay, and really all you need to know is that the foreground color in most of our cases means the text, right? So you click on this little eyedropper and it allows you to highlight over any elements on the page. So we can pick up our text color here. And then the background color is usually literally like the background color behind the text. So you use the eyedropper again, and we can pick up my background color here. And you can see a little preview of what I selected to make sure you pick the things that you thought you picked, right? Step one. And then you can see the actual contrast ratio as well as what level of accessibility it passes. And you can see that mine passes the AAA standard because AA is just never good enough for me.
Kind of an overachiever there, Rebecca.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question about Margaret here. I have a question about the using a smart art from Microsoft Word Office. So it makes it it makes the chart and tables look very interesting. But I wanted to know what are the accessibility, the considerations that I should have when I use those shapes.
Yeah, so I don't use a lot of smart art on there, but I have certainly used it in the design of PowerPoint slides and to some extent in Word and things like that. So I think that the main things follow, which is the size of your text is going to be really important with the smart art because it's constantly sort of pre-populating and adjusting the sides. It moves the text size automatically. And so you have to be cautious, right? That you haven't either put too much into it or the way that the tool is set up, the one that you selected, doesn't wind up leaving your text below that 24 font size, 24-point font size. If you're in a PowerPoint document, obviously you have a little bit more leeway in something like a Word document, but even in that case, you don't want to go smaller than 12-point. So that's the first thing. The second thing though, in this you can, and you do have the ability to adjust the background and the foreground colors of your text or of the shape in the smart art. And that's when you want to do exactly what Rebecca just talked about and make sure that you're not using those defaults that are not accessible colors, that you want to kind of either use the ones that just have an outline of the shapes and, no color in the background, or adjust the color if you want to try and differentiate, say, between 4 different boxes in the smart art, so that you've got that one light, one medium, one dark.
So,
The other thing to be aware of too is that sometimes the shapes and things require alt text. And if you use the accessibility checker built into any of the Office products, it will prompt you if something does need alt text.
okay, that was actually my follow-up question. So, for example, when I want to show them like advantages and disadvantages of something, I use smart art because it can, compare boxes right in front of each other, right across from each other, advantage versus disadvantage, for example. So in these situations, how does the reader like read the shapes? In the alt text, should I like explain completely what the chart is going to say, or should I just tell them that this is comparing advantages versus disadvantages?
I wouldn't rely on these default kind of drawing things at all to communicate what you wanted to communicate, right, to someone who's using a screen reader. Just often they aren't quite right. So the more you can provide kind of the text equivalent elsewhere, right, in the same context, either you're explaining it verbally, right, because you're doing a presentation, or if it's a written document, you have that further detail written out, the better, because often it might not be displayed quite in the right order. You can control some of the ordering and stuff in Microsoft products using the accessibility tools and things, but there's some things you can't fully control.
Thank you very much.
Can I ask a follow-up question about the alt text? So for the alt text, like for Michelle's image, should the alt text say something like this image is of a graph, or do you want to make it more concise where you say this graph is of, or just describe it?
You want to take it, Rebecca, or you want me to talk about it?
Well, I'll start with, you never say this is an image of. Because the screen reader already knows it's an image. So that's really redundant. And so if you're having to process a lot of that auditory information, that just like becomes really laborsome. So you want to avoid that. And you want to make sure that you're conveying the information that the graph is meant to convey. So if there's specific numbers or values and things that are really important for someone to get away from like the image, then you want to make sure that's communicated in alt text. That said, alt text should really only be a sentence or two. And if you need more than that, then you need like a paragraph to accompany it.
Yeah, so Kristen, for that pie chart specifically, I would literally say pie chart depicting the distribution of participants in challenge. In that particular case, because it was for a PowerPoint, let's say that I was recording a lecture for my students, I would go on to describe that further anyway, right? Because that would be the only thing on the screen. So I would say, what we see here is that the majority of participants are from X category. And so like that would become part of the file as well, because that would be in my transcription and the audio of it. So it would go on to expand further than what the alt text says, but the alt text is just literally what are we looking at? That is a great segue, however, to the fact that we have that Tuesday is alt text day. So we have some great sections coming up on Tuesday on alt text. I just want to draw everyone's attention to that because these two topics do wind up getting kind of related. At 1:30 on Tuesday, Kate Percival is doing a session on text equivalence. And then is it 1:30 or 1 o'clock? I'm sorry, I may have the time wrong. I need to double check that for you guys. But and then at 3 o'clock, Casey is taking that a step further and talking about formulas and math equations and how we think about making those accessible, which is sort of a similar but related topic.
It's 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock. Thank you for that update. Julie, go ahead.
This is maybe for Casey. Casey, your thing on formulas and math equations, would that pertain to music at all? I mean, is it the theories of it?
I don't know that it necessarily will, other than the numeric notation. I think would carry over and work. Mathematical equations, the standard seems to have settled largely on a code referred to as MathML. And there's some easy ways to create the math equation, and the MathML gets made for you. And so for time signatures and some things like that, I think it would help. But for other things, I don't know that it will.
Okay, thanks.
So with that, do we have any other questions today about color contrast using them in any of the products that we're talking about or the checkers?
One thing I will note is that we do have a session on accessibility checkers at the end of next week. So you might want to check that out if you're unfamiliar. But one warning about it is that many of these automated checkers do not fully do color contrast checking. So having this extra little tool is super helpful.
Great. I want to remind everybody that we also have our 2:00 drop-in session today. That is your opportunity to bring anything specific that you're working on. If you have a PowerPoint, if you got something with smart art in it or charts, or you're working on something to go on a web-based platform, we are happy to kind of walk you through that, the color tool a little bit more one-on-one, or any other questions that you have remaining burning in the back of your mind from all of the things accessibility related over the last 5 days. We've got that today, as well as all next week, Tuesday through Friday at 2:00 as well. So we have been enjoying our sessions in the afternoon and had the opportunity to, I think, really dig in deeper. So if you've got some questions that you don't want to ask in a big group, we are happy to work one-on-one with you as well.
Well, thanks everyone.
Have a great afternoon.